The invitation had been sitting unanswered for 3 days. Amara Collins almost declined it. The venue alone said everything: private dining room, invitation only, the kind of place where people spoke softly but measured everything. Status, history, memory. The silver table didn't invite people by accident. She arrived anyway. The hostess led her through a corridor of muted gold light and low conversation. Laughter rose and fell in careful intervals. Glassware chimed softly. Amara smoothed the sleeve of her dress and kept her expression neutral. Nothing about her outfit demanded attention. Nothing about her posture asked for approval. That was the first mistake they made. Daniel Collins looked up mid-sentence. The pause was brief, but it was there. A flicker of surprise he didn't bother to hide before replacing it with something smoother, more familiar. Cynthia Moore followed his gaze, her eyes sweeping Amara from head to toe, cataloging quietly. Patrick Reynolds leaned back, curiosity already shaped into judgment. No one stood. Amara took the empty chair offered at the edge of the table and sat. Hands folded, back straight.
Calm.
She felt it immediately, the subtle shift, the silent question passing between them. Why is she here? Daniel recovered first. He always did. A smile that didn't reach his eyes, a tone polished by years of being believed. I didn't realize you'd be joining us, he said lightly, as if this were a coincidence instead of a collision. Amara met his gaze and nodded once.
Neither did I, she replied.
The conversation resumed without her. They spoke around her, not to her. Cynthia referenced old social circles, glancing Amara's way as if checking whether she remembered them. Patrick discussed ventures and connections, dropping names like currency. Daniel filled in the gaps, too helpfully, too confidently. She's always been reserved, he said at one point, smiling into his glass. Prefer to stay in the background. Amara said nothing. She felt their conclusions settle into place, neat and comfortable. The ex-wife. The quiet one. The woman who used to belong here, maybe once. The woman who clearly didn't anymore. They mistook her silence for agreement. For weakness. For absence. No one asked why she was there. No one thought to. Amara listened. She watched. She let the moment stretch, because some truths don't need defending. They only need time. And time, she knew, was about to run out. Amara hadn't come to be seen. That was the truth she kept returning to as she followed the hostess into the private dining room. The invitation hadn't promised opportunity or reconciliation or closure. It had simply asked if she would attend. She said yes because saying no would have meant explaining herself, to someone, to herself, and she was tired of doing that. The table was already half full. Silver-rimmed place settings caught the light. Crystal glasses stood untouched, aligned with the kind of precision that suggested rules no one ever bothered to say out loud. Amara paused just long enough to take it in, then stepped forward when the hostess indicated an open seat near the end. Not the center. Not the head. It didn't bother her. She took her chair and smoothed her napkin across her lap, the movement small and practiced. Around her, conversation drifted, investment chatter, travel plans, the soft laughter of people comfortable in rooms like this. Amara listened without leaning in. She had learned, over time, how to be present without performing. Daniel was there, of course. She had known he would be the moment she recognized the names on the invitation. He didn't look at her right away. When he did, it was with the mild surprise of someone spotting an old acquaintance in a place they hadn't expected them to be. Not unpleasant. Not warm either. Cynthia Moore sat 2 seats down, posture immaculate, smile selective. Patrick Reynolds across from her, jacket draped just so, eyes already assessing. The silver table in full effect, polished, confident, certain of their position in the world. Amara didn't resent them for it. She accepted the water offered by the server and nodded her thanks.
No wine.
Not tonight. She wasn't here to soften anything. The chair beside her remained empty, and she found herself oddly grateful for the space. It gave her room to breathe, to settle. The familiar hum of anticipation never came. No tightening in her chest. No need to prove or prepare. She wasn't here for validation. When the conversation brushed close, Someone mentioning a partnership she recognized, a deal she'd quietly advised on. Amara kept her eyes on the table. She didn't correct anyone. She didn't insert herself. The silence wasn't restraint so much as choice. Daniel leaned back at one point, crossing his arms, his voice carrying just enough. "Funny how these dinners bring people together," he said. "You never know who you'll run into." A few polite chuckles. Cynthia's eyes flicked to Amara, then away. Amara met Daniel's gaze briefly. Long enough to acknowledge the moment. Not long enough to invite anything else. She was exactly where she intended to be. The server announced that dinner would begin shortly. Chairs shifted. Glasses were filled. The room settled into expectation. Amara folded her hands and waited. Whatever they thought this night would be, she knew better. Some seats are given. Others are earned. And she had earned hers long before she arrived. Daniel noticed her the way people notice something out of place. Not immediately, but eventually when the shape of the room didn't quite add up. His gaze caught on her halfway through a sentence. He faltered for a fraction of a second, the pause barely perceptible, then continued speaking as if nothing had happened. But Amara saw it. She had lived with that look long enough to recognize it even now. Surprise first. Then assessment. He studied her openly this time, no attempt to disguise it. The hair, slightly shorter than he remembered. The calm in her posture. The absence of nerves. He seemed to be searching for something familiar, some sign that she was still who he had decided she was. She didn't give it to him. Daniel's mouth curved into a smile that once meant reassurance and now meant control. "Amara," he said at last, as if remembering her name were a courtesy. "I didn't realize you were coming." There it was. Not welcome. Not how are you. Just surprise, sharpened into implication. She met his eyes. "Neither did I," she said evenly. The smile lingered a moment too long. He nodded, as though confirming a private thought, then turned back to the table. "Small world," he added, lifting his glass. Cynthia leaned in toward him, her voice low but not quiet enough. "You know each other?" Daniel chuckled softly. "We were married. A lifetime ago." Patrick raised his eyebrows, interest piqued. "Really?" Amara felt the weight of it then. Not the words themselves, but the way they shifted the room. She was no longer just a guest.
She was context. History.
Something already defined. Daniel continued, his tone conversational, almost generous. Amara was never fond of scenes like this. Always preferred staying out of the spotlight. He glanced at her, inviting agreement.
She didn't respond.
Cynthia's lips pressed together in a polite smile. "That must have been difficult," she said, her eyes flicking over Amara as if searching for proof. "These circles can be demanding." Amara nodded once. A non-answer. A boundary. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms, settling into the role he knew best. The interpreter. "She's always been thoughtful," he added. "Careful. Sometimes too careful." Patrick laughed lightly. "Nothing wrong with that," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Ambition looks different on different people." Amara listened as if she were overhearing strangers discuss someone else entirely. The version of her they were assembling was neat and manageable. Non-threatening. Finished. She felt no urge to interrupt. Daniel watched her now with a faint crease between his brows, unsettled by her quiet. When they'd been married, silence from her had always meant concession. Agreement. Retreat. This silence was different. It didn't ask for permission. It didn't soften. It waited. And as the conversation moved on, leaving her unnamed but fully judged, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something about her had changed, something he no longer knew how to read. For the first time that evening, his confidence wavered. Amara noticed. She said nothing. Cynthia was the first to press. She did it gently, the way people do when they don't want to appear unkind. Her questions were wrapped in concern, her smile practiced and warm. "So, Amara," she said, turning fully toward her now, "what have you been keeping busy with these days?" The table quieted just enough to listen. Amara felt it, the shift from being spoken about to being examined. She lifted her gaze and met Cynthia's eyes. "Work," she replied.
Simple. Honest.
Cynthia nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. Of course. Still consulting. She glanced briefly at Daniel, then back again. Or, have you moved on to something more settled? Patrick leaned forward, elbows on the table. Consulting can be tricky, he said lightly. So much uncertainty. I imagine stability starts to matter more at a certain point. Daniel smiled into his glass. Amara considered correcting them.
Considered explaining.
Instead, she took a sip of water and let the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed. I enjoy the flexibility, she said at last. Cynthia's smile widened. That makes sense. Not everyone is wired for high-pressure environments. She said it kindly, almost admiringly. There's something refreshing about knowing your limits. Patrick chuckled.
Exactly.
Some people thrive on risk. Others contribute in quieter ways. They weren't cruel. Not on the surface. That was the point. They spoke as if they were protecting her from expectations, from scrutiny, from a world she had supposedly failed to conquer. Each comment built carefully on the last, reinforcing a version of her that required no challenge. Daniel watched it unfold with something close to relief. Amara listened, her face calm, her posture unchanged. Inside, old memories stirred, not pain, but recognition. She remembered this dynamic. The way her restraint had always been mistaken for hesitation. The way her caution had been framed as fear. She remembered how often she'd been spoken for. Patrick tilted his head, studying her. You seem very centered, he said. That must have come with time. It did, Amara agreed. Cynthia clasped her hands together. That's wonderful. Growth looks different for everyone. The conversation drifted away again, satisfied. They had labeled her, smoothed her edges, returned her neatly to the margins. No one noticed the slight tension settling over the table, the faint discomfort that came from realizing she hadn't defended herself, hadn't tried to fit the story they were telling. Daniel frowned, just briefly, because somewhere beneath the politeness, something didn't align. Amara wasn't shrinking. She was waiting. And though Cynthia and Patrick leaned back, confident in the conclusions they'd reached, the air around Amara felt strangely charged, like a truth being held just below the surface, patient and unmoved. Polite cruelty had done its work, but it hadn't done its damage. Not yet. By the time the first course arrived, the decision had already been made. It wasn't announced. It never was. The silver table didn't vote or confer. They simply adjusted, chairs angled subtly away from Amara, conversation flowing past her instead of toward her. The shift was seamless, practiced. Inclusion withdrawn, without spectacle. Cynthia turned to Patrick to discuss a foundation board appointment. Patrick responded with an anecdote about a recent retreat in Aspen. Daniel leaned in, adding context, names, history. Their voices blended into an easy rhythm that didn't leave space for interruption. Amara listened. She noticed how questions stopped coming her way, how the server hesitated before refilling her glass, unsure whether she was part of the group or merely adjacent to it, how Daniel no longer glanced at her for confirmation, only for reassurance, proof that his assessment had been correct. She was calm, quiet, limited.
Dismissed.
Someone mentioned an upcoming partnership, a deal Amara recognized instantly. She had reviewed the projections months earlier, flagged the weak assumptions, recommended a revision that had saved more than one investor from embarrassment. She said nothing now. Patrick laughed at something Cynthia said, the sound ringing a little too loudly. This table has always had a good sense for people, he remarked. We know who fits. Daniel nodded. That's important. Alignment. Amara felt the words land, not as an insult, but as a conclusion. She didn't fit. At least, not the version of her they had agreed upon. The waiter placed her plate gently in front of her. She thanked him, her voice steady. She ate slowly, methodically, tasting each bite. Across the table, Daniel spoke with growing ease, the tension from earlier replaced by confidence. He had reclaimed familiar ground. This was the story he understood. Amara, the quiet one, the careful one, the woman who stayed on the edges while others stepped forward. Cynthia glanced at her once more, then looked away, satisfied. Patrick had already moved on, his attention caught by someone newly arrived at the far end of the table. The silver table expanded and contracted as it pleased, drawing lines that felt permanent only to those who believed them. Amara folded her napkin neatly when she finished. She rested her hands in her lap and waited. She felt no urgency, no sting. They had made their decision based on what was visible, on what had been offered. They had mistaken composure for compliance, silence for insignificance. That was their mistake to make. The room settled into the comfort of certainty, unaware of how fragile it was. Conversations layered over one another. Laughter rose, unexamined. Amara remained exactly where she was, unmoved, unseen, and very much not finished. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as casual conversation, the way most important things did in rooms like this. Patrick mentioned a recent stumble, an investment that hadn't performed as expected. Nothing dramatic, just a miscalculation. Cynthia tilted her head, thoughtful, and asked whether the advisory team had adjusted the model in time. Daniel frowned. They did, he said. At the last minute. Patrick nodded. Lucky timing, really. Saved us a mess. Amara's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She recognized the deal immediately. The timing, the structure, the late adjustment that had changed everything. She remembered sitting at her desk months ago, reviewing the assumptions, noticing the quiet flaw no one else had questioned. She remembered sending the memo, careful and precise, knowing it might be ignored. It hadn't been. Patrick continued, warming to the story. Whoever caught it had good instincts. That kind of foresight is rare. Cynthia smiled. It's why we trust our consultants. Amara lowered her fork and finished chewing, her expression unchanged. She didn't look up.
She didn't speak.
She let the moment stretch. Daniel leaned back, crossing his arms. Still, he said, it's not the sort of thing everyone can spot. Takes a certain mindset. Patrick glanced toward Amara, then away again, as if the thought had passed through him without fully forming.
True, he said.
Not everyone sees the whole picture. The conversation moved on, touching another project, another outcome, another narrow escape, each one threaded together by a common detail, an intervention, a recalculation, a decision made quietly before anyone else realized it mattered. Amara felt the air change. It was subtle at first. Cynthia's brow creased as she tried to place something. Patrick's voice slowed, his confidence dimming into curiosity. Daniel watched her now, openly, his earlier ease giving way to uncertainty. He was remembering, not specifics, not facts, just the feeling of moments during their marriage when Amara had warned him about risks he'd dismissed, of conversations he'd half listened to, of results he'd claimed credit for without quite understanding why they'd worked. Patrick cleared his throat. Funny, he said. The consultant on that first project. Do you remember who it was? Cynthia shook her head.
No.
The firm changed shortly after. Daniel's gaze fixed on Amara, sharp now. Searching. She lifted her eyes then, meeting his without challenge or triumph. Just presence. I remember, she said softly. The table stilled. She didn't elaborate.
She didn't need to.
The truth hovered between them, newly visible, unsettling in its simplicity. The silver table had decided earlier. Now, for the first time that evening, they began to wonder if they decided too soon. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It didn't slide past unnoticed or settle comfortably at the edges of the table. It lingered, dense, expectant, forcing everyone to sit inside it. Even the soft clink of cutlery from nearby tables seemed distant now, muffled by the sudden awareness that something had changed. Patrick was the first to feel it. He straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Cynthia's fingers stilled where they rested against her glass. Daniel didn't move at all. Amara remained still. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't corrected anyone, She had simply spoken when a moment arrived, and then stopped. The restraint unsettled them more than any interruption would have. "So, you weren't involved?" Cynthia asked carefully, her tone neutral but her posture alert. Amara met her gaze. "In some capacity." Patrick let out a quiet breath, halfway to a laugh that never fully formed.
"Interesting," he said.
"That wasn't mentioned." "No," Amara replied. "It wasn't." Daniel's jaw tightened. He watched her the way someone watches a locked door they're suddenly unsure they have the key to. "You never said," he began, then stopped. The rest of the sentence didn't come. She didn't fill the gap for him. The pause stretched again, heavier now, layered with recalculation. Cynthia glanced down the table, gauging reactions. Patrick leaned back, reassessing not just Amara, but the conclusions he'd accepted so easily earlier. Around them, the room continued as before, laughter rising from another table, a server moving past with practiced ease, but the silver table had lost its rhythm. The flow of conversation had stalled, caught on something unspoken. Daniel cleared his throat. "Well," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite settle, "that certainly puts things in a different light." Amara said nothing.
She didn't need to.
The light was shifting on its own, revealing angles they hadn't bothered to examine. Her silence no longer read as absence. It read as confidence. Patrick tilted his head, studying her openly now. "You've been very understated," he said. Amara's lips curved, just slightly. "I find it helps." Cynthia exhaled, a small sound of acknowledgement she didn't seem aware she'd made. The narrative they'd constructed, careful, quiet, peripheral, was fraying at the edges. Not destroyed.
Not yet.
But no longer secure. Daniel looked at Amara again, really looked this time. Not at the woman he'd left. Not at the version of her he'd described. At the one sitting in front of him now, composed, unmoved, waiting. He realized then that the pause wasn't hers. It was theirs. And they were the ones struggling to fill it. Amara set her glass down gently. The sound was small, but it carried. "I didn't say anything earlier," she began, her voice even unhurried, "because I wasn't sure it mattered." She looked around the table, not seeking permission, not asking for approval, simply stating a fact. "This dinner wasn't about me." Daniel shifted in his chair. "But," she continued, "since my name seems to have entered the conversation, I should clarify a few things." No one interrupted her. Patrick's attention was fully on her now. Cynthia's polite smile had faded into focus. "The project you mentioned earlier," Amara said, turning slightly toward Patrick, "the one that nearly failed before the adjustment, it was mine. I flagged the risk in the model, recommended the revision, and advised delaying the rollout until the data supported it." Patrick blinked. "You advised on that?" "Yes." "And the second deal?" Cynthia asked quietly. Amara nodded once. "I reviewed that as well. The assumptions were optimistic. The margins didn't support the expansion timeline." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That memo," he said slowly. "The one that came in late." Amara met his eyes. "It wasn't late. It just wasn't loud." The words landed without force, without accusation. They didn't need either. She continued, calm as ever. "I consult independently. I don't attach my name unless it's necessary. I prefer my work to stand on its own." A pause. "It usually does." The silence that followed was different again, not tense this time, but attentive. Patrick leaned forward, elbows on the table. Cynthia's gaze sharpened, reassessing every assumption she'd made earlier in the evening. Daniel looked stunned. Not angry, not defensive, just stunned. "You never told me," he said, his voice low. Amara didn't flinch. "You never asked." She let that sit, then went on. "When we were married, you said I played things too safe, that I needed to think bigger." Her tone didn't change. "I did. Just not the way you expected." Patrick exhaled slowly. "How many projects?" he asked. Amara considered. "Enough to know when to walk away. Enough to know when staying quiet is the right move." Cynthia nodded. almost to herself. That explains a great deal. Amara folded her hands again, returning to stillness. I didn't come here to correct anyone. I came because I was invited. Because I belong at this table as much as anyone else. She looked at Daniel one last time, not with triumph, not with resentment. With clarity. The rest, she said softly, you decided on your own. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The truth had arrived. And it wasn't asking to be believed. Daniel sat back slowly, as if the movement required more effort than it should have. He looked at Amara the way one looks at a familiar place after learning it has a hidden floor, recognition layered with disquiet. Pieces of memory began to rearrange themselves without his permission. Conversations he'd half listened to. Warnings he'd dismissed. The way she'd always paused before answering, not out of uncertainty, but calculation. He had mistaken patience for hesitation. You are doing all of this, he said, more to himself than to her. There was no accusation in his voice. Just disbelief. While I thought you were waiting. Amara didn't correct him.
She didn't need to.
The truth had already moved past explanation. Cynthia broke the silence first, her tone thoughtful now, stripped of its earlier softness. It's impressive, she said. You've been influencing outcomes without positioning yourself. Patrick nodded. That's not easy. Most people want credit. Amara met his gaze. Credit isn't the point. Impact is. Daniel flinched slightly at that. He remembered arguments that had ended with him accusing her of lacking ambition, of not wanting more. He remembered how confidently he'd said it, how certain he'd been that he understood her limits. He saw now that he'd never bothered to ask where she'd placed them. I thought, he began, then stopped. He tried again. I thought I was the one pushing us forward. Amara's expression didn't change.
You were moving, she said.
Just not always forward. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They were precise, and precision had always been her strength. Daniel let out a short breath and looked down at the table. For the first time that evening, he seemed unsure of his footing. I built an entire story about you, he admitted quietly. And I believed it. Yes, Amara said. You did. The table was listening again, not out of curiosity now, but recalibration. Cynthia watched Daniel with new interest. Patrick's earlier confidence had softened into respect. The silver table, so quick to decide, was quietly revising its conclusions. Daniel looked up once more, meeting Amara's eyes. There was no appeal there. No request for absolution. Just understanding, arriving too late to change anything. I never really knew you, he said. Amara considered that. Then she nodded. No, she replied gently. You didn't. She didn't say it with bitterness.
She didn't need to.
The realization belonged to him alone. Around them, conversation began again, cautious at first, then steadier. Questions were asked, this time directly. Opinions sought without assumption. The room adjusted, shifting to accommodate a truth it hadn't anticipated. Amara remained composed, answering when she chose, withholding when she didn't. Daniel watched her now with something like humility, the old confidence replaced by clarity. He understood, finally, that her silence had never been emptiness. It had been depth. And he had never looked far enough to see it. The evening loosened its grip slowly. Conversation resumed around Amara, but it no longer pressed in on her. Questions came now with intention, not inspection. She answered a few, declined others, her voice steady, her boundaries intact. The silver table adjusted its posture around her presence, careful where it hadn't been before. Daniel remained quiet. When the plates were cleared and chairs began to shift, Amara felt the familiar signal rise in her chest, the subtle certainty that it was time. She folded her napkin once, precisely, and placed it beside her plate.
I should go, she said, standing.
Cynthia looked up at her, surprised. Already? Amara smiled, polite and complete. Yes. Patrick stood as well, nodding. I hope we continue this conversation. Perhaps, Amara replied. It wasn't a promise. It didn't need to be.
Daniel rose last.
He hesitated, then spoke her name softly, stripped of its old authority. Amara. She turned to him, giving him her full attention for the first time that night.
I see you now, he said.
I wish I had. She lifted a hand gently, stopping him without sharpness. I know, she said. But that moment passed. He nodded, accepting it. There was relief in his eyes. Pain too, but those were his to carry. Amara reached for her coat and slipped it on, the movement unhurried. As she walked away from the table, she felt no rush of triumph, no echo of vindication. Just quiet. The room watched her go. Not with judgment this time. With recognition. Outside, the air was cool and clean, a contrast to the layered weight of the evening. Amara paused on the steps, breathing it in, feeling the tension leave her shoulders all at once. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding until it was gone. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't asked to be understood. She had simply been, and that had been enough. As she walked away, the light behind her softened, the sounds of the dinner fading into the background where they belonged. The silver table would go on deciding who fit, who mattered, who belonged. Amara no longer needed their conclusions. She had come without expectations. She left without weight.
Scene.
Unburdened. Complete.